Are you tired of your boring old Imperium buildings looking perfectly fine? Well, then it's time to make them unnaturally rusty and cover them in ironic posters, some of which maybe you and only a dozen other people will understand.
Hello everyone, my name is Tyler Russo. I'm a civic ambassador for the Imperial Ministry of Municipal Beautification and Grimdark Preservation. Today, I'm gonna show you how to make your buildings look like they've been sitting in a dumpster for 6 to 7 months. We're going for a brown mystery stained theme. If you ever felt like brutalist architecture wasn't sad, well, oh boy, I have a building for you. That's right, we're combining it with high gothic. We're gonna take cool concrete stains and the way that buildings tend to look dirty beyond repair, known to brutalism, and combine that with the spooky stylings from gothic architecture that make you feel like you're on the edge of a bottomless pit of despair, and we're gonna have ourselves a ball. Also, I guess this can be the Halloween episode.
To start, I began painting the hundreds of skulls that the previous owner had rightfully ignored. I bought this building secondhand specifically because it was already base coated, and this way I could skip most of the base coating stage and go right to the fun step of ruining the model with too much weathering. I like to use wraithbone or arid earth or any kind of off-white color for skulls. I feel like if you use pure white, it makes them look like plaster skulls from a paint your own pottery place. And after that, I went over any of the gold areas that the previous owner had not base coated that well with Kahana's gold. Sorry, I don't know how to actually pronounce any of these GW paint names. And after that, it was time to absolutely drown the model in enamel paints. Oil paint's really good for this purpose too if you have those, and if you don't like using chemicals that'll kill you, then any of the Army Painter shades or the GW brand shades should work here too. The reason I like enamels more is you can use odorless paint thinner to keep working with them after they initially dry. And I also think it looks better on flat surfaces. They smell pretty bad though. You definitely need proper ventilation, and I would recommend wearing a respirator too. You could also water down just normal model acrylic paint that you have instead. For rust, I really like using thin orange and usually like a dark brown after the orange is dry. If you're trying to follow along using GW paints, I would use maybe Troll Slayer instead of an orange enamel. But really, what's 15 to 20 years off your life in exchange for marginally better weathering? I use several different layers of all of these paints and various combinations with no real calculation or planning put into it, and sprayed them through my airbrush to create shadows and gradients in the Aquila. Then I progressively added more paint thinner to the point where the paint was ultimately super transparent, as you can see here at the bottom. You can copy this if you want by using, it's probably like really watered down dry at dark, and a big layer brush, but the airbrush will get you much smoother results. I also applied this same paint to some of the metal areas and the bottom of the skeletons. Just a nice way to easily build contrast. These flat areas are very weird because they're super unnatural looking, and the best way to add quick detail to them that I've found is just by doing little gradients. I'd also recommend before you do this to add some like big splotchy orange areas and metal dry brushing to create texture so it feels less flat. I airbrushed the very bottom of the Aquila with pure dryad dark. Pure isn't the only pigment I use. They still use thinner here, to be clear, just to help make that gradient pop a little bit more. And any areas that look like they might have been destroyed by fire damage, I airbrush some black on to represent that. If you don't have an airbrush, dry brushing with a big flat brush would work here too. I felt like the transition from the dark gradient to the gold of the Aquila was a little too much, so I used some Wild Rider red and Mephiston red blended together to make it less bad. And you want to go pretty thin here because you don't want to cover up the metallic paint flakes of the gold underneath. And I mixed too much of this color, so I used it to go over some of the metallic areas that I thought were lacking contrast and any of the areas that were still entirely silver. And then I used some bright gold by Army Painter to highlight the middle section of the Aquila, making a brighter gradient in the center. And if you don't have an airbrush, you can dry brush here if you wanted to. Just be very light and careful. This is a good time to stop and clean your airbrush, during which you lose the little front nozzle if it's like 1/10 of an inch in length. Then drive to the Burbank Hobby Lobby, roughly 15 minutes north of where you live. Attempt to use this 40% off one item at regular price coupon. Attempt to buy an Iwata Eclipse All-Star Versatility HPCS airbrush kit, which seems too good to be true. But some guy on Reddit in 2018 says he was able to get one, and that's all the confirmation your brain needs right now. You arrive at the Hobby Lobby dressed exactly like this, and they tell you that they're out of stock, but there's another Hobby Lobby an hour and 15 minutes south of you in current traffic that has one. You arrive at the Hobby Lobby located located in Hawthorne, California, at which point they inform you that the coupon is no good. The next step is to buy one anyways because of sunk cost fallacy, and then sit in your car for 15 minutes debating if you've made the right decision or not. You realize because there's no one really in there and you park directly in front of the Hobby Lobby, the employees have probably noticed that you've just been sitting in your car for 15 minutes, but that embarrassment isn't enough to stop you from going back inside and asking for a refund. In a heated moment of impulse and instinct, you open the Amazon app on your phone and purchase an insanely nice German airbrush that's roughly 3 times the value of what you're expecting to spend today. Also probably too fancy and sophisticated for you to fully utilize, and it's gonna be here tomorrow. You also buy an anti-cubic wash and cure machine because fuck it. After you're done doing that, the next step is to apply some Army Painter Purple Tone Quick Shade. I use this in any detail areas that I wanted to be more defined, and I also put a heavy amount at the bottom of all the little vents that are around the building to give the impression that they've been heated to a high temperature. After that, I used Reikland Flesh Shade to much the same effect. Provides a slightly lighter alternative and is good for trying to blend in the darkness of the purple with the later colors surrounding it. One of my favorite aspects of all of Warhammer is making stupid posters. The sardonic, comically depressive nature of 40k has always been one of my favorite parts, but I feel like often in some ways the gameplay feels divorced from those aspects of the setting, and making posters has been a nice way to reintroduce those aspects into the ambiance of the game. I'll put a download link to these posters in the video description as well as on Patreon. A lot of them are very archaic references and in-jokes that probably won't make much sense to you at all, but hopefully you like some of them. I used a straight edge ruler and an X-Acto blade to cut them out. It's a lot easier than using scissors, and I would recommend doing the same. Once you get your poster all nice and cut out, you can use craft glue to adhere it to the building. Elmer's works. Certain fabric glues work fine too. Any sort of PVA glue will be okay here. You want most of the glue to be in the center because when you press down and apply pressure, it'll spread out to the corners and leak out the sides. If it's a small amount of glue, it probably won't be that noticeable, but you can take a brush just to like wick away any of the excess glue that leaks out. The posters also provide a nice sense of scale and an opportunity to introduce some different colors to the building. Season the building with decals to taste. I added a bunch of tiny ones everywhere. They help break up the large flat areas and give your eyes something to focus on. And after you seal all the decals with a thin coat of matte varnish, it's time to go hog wild with grime again. Making the posters and decals dirty helps blend them in with the building, and the reason I put them on after weathering most of the building is because it's annoying to try and avoid painting them when you're doing the weathering in the big areas, and I think it looks more natural this way. At some point, which I think I forgot to mention, I also did a big old wash on all of the skulls with brown. Any brown will do, just make it brown. Then I dry brushed all of the skulls and the skeleton bits with arid earth again? Or reef bone? Yeah, the colors don't matter. The next step is to paint all the little lights with Army Painter blue green by hand, and let me tell you, it feels awful. I want to throw up just thinking about it. After that, the next step is to apply a little bit of a watered down shade of turquoise, just to make a gradient with the other blue. Then, in an inspired moment of panic and desperation, decide that you've had enough of painting lights by hand, and it's time to make a Frankenstein airbrush. I got this extremely nice Grex airbrush as a birthday present when I was 16, and of course, I had no idea what I was doing with it, so I kind of ruined it. The needle's been bent for years, and some of the parts inside had some damage too. And a couple years ago, I just got this like really cheap Badger knockoff brush for like $20 from eBay. It's a like Chinese, not counterfeit. I don't know. It's an off-brand version. Knockoff, that's the word. And they're from different manufacturers, obviously, so I didn't think they would fit, but I managed to. Actually, I don't know if they fit. I don't think they're supposed to go together and be compatible, but the parts kind of fit from one to the other, and we were able to make that work for at least a few minutes of this airbrush's newfound life. I might use this reanimated airbrush as a base coat brush because the spray is very, very big and inconsistent, but I'll probably just go back to using the airbrush I spent way too much money on for the most part from this point forward. Okay, now that's done, I went and used that same dark turquoise color to apply a little bit of a shade just around the edges. It's a lot easier than trying to paint the whole light with multiple layers this way. And the last step was to use some weathering powder just to add some more texture. All the weathering powders I used are by a company called Secret Weapon Miniatures, and I used a pigment fixer pigment fixative. Wait, let me go in the other room and check. Okay, yeah, they're called pigment fixers. There's a bunch of different companies that make them, and they're all kind of the same. So if you've never used weathering powders, I think they look the best dry when you just like straight up put them on there. But the problem is if you put them on dry, then they tend to flake off a lot over time. And unless it's like a diorama, it's probably not worth putting on, because if you're playing with the models, the powder will just like get everywhere like Cheetos dust. It's basically Cheetos dust. You're painting of Cheetos dust. And if you do it that way and you put matte varnish on, which is the way to make it stay, or hairspray, as some people like to do, they'll look a lot more dull than they were previously. So from my experience, the best way to do it is you use the pigment fixer with a bunch of the weathering powder, and then it'll look like kind of weird when you first put it on, but as it dries it'll look better, and it'll look closer to that way than if you were to put on the dry like pigment and then matte varnish it. I use these pigment colored pencils to add some scratches. These are by Ammo, but I think there's quite a few companies that make similar kind of things. Yeah, I don't know exactly what they're made of, but to my understanding they're basically just dry pigment, which is cool because if you add water to them you can manipulate them with a brush and create neat like stains and streaking effects, and also they just look good as scratches. I use the normal graphite pencil at some point too to add some scratches. The graphite's nice because it has a little bit of a metallic tint to it, and yeah, that's basically it. Terrain is a very important part of 40k to me, obviously from a gameplay perspective, but also just like having nice terrain really sells the narrative, and after a lifetime of mostly painting orc boys, it's fun to paint something this big. And yeah, as I said earlier, I'm gonna have a link to all the posters in the video description if you want to download them. And as always, if you like this video and you want to support me on Patreon or subscribe, that would be very cool and I would appreciate it a lot. Quick update on these little guys. I'm still planning on doing a retro orc spelled with a C Kickstarter at some point soon, but I want to make it good and I want to not rush to try and get it out by October. So it won't be up this month, but it will be out at some point, and I think it's a good thing that I'm waiting, and it's going to be better and we're going to have more models and it's going to be great. I hope this inspires you to make some buildings of your own, and if you don't want to do some miniature building, try doing it on a local municipal building. Maybe an Amazon warehouse, or you could do it at a Best Buy, or maybe on the home of your mayor or some sort of city official. Perhaps you could weather your local Hobby Lobby. You just get out there and start weathering. Bring your enamel paints and have a good time. Don't forget the posters. Okay, thanks for coming. Happy Halloween.